this episode, we're going to take zero trust from being a buzzword you hear in security conversations and turn it into an architectural way of thinking that a beginner can actually apply. The easiest mistake to make is to treat zero trust as a product you buy or a switch you flip, when it is really a set of design choices about how trust is granted, how it is limited, and how it is rechecked over time. The reason it matters is that modern systems are no longer contained inside one neat internal network, and attackers do not politely stop at the perimeter once they get a foothold. People work remotely, services live in cloud environments, and integrations connect systems across organizations, which means the old assumption that inside equals safe has become unreliable. Zero trust starts by rejecting that assumption and replacing it with a stronger one. Every access request is evaluated deliberately based on identity, context, and policy. When you understand subjects, objects, zones, perimeters, and reauthentication, you can design systems that make compromise harder to spread and easier to detect. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to begin is to define what zero trust is trying to fix, because it is not claiming that trust should literally be zero at all times. The target is implicit trust, which is the kind of trust you get automatically just because you are in a certain place, like being on an internal network or connected to a certain Wi-Fi. Implicit trust becomes dangerous because it turns a single success, like stolen credentials or one compromised laptop, into broad movement across the environment. Zero trust replaces implicit trust with explicit trust decisions that are narrow, justified, and continuously validated. That means access is granted based on who the requester is, what they are trying to access, and whether the request meets defined conditions right now. Beginners sometimes hear the name and think it means you distrust everyone all the time, but the more accurate interpretation is that you trust carefully and you prove that trust repeatedly. The architecture goal is not to punish users with friction, but to make access decisions resilient when the environment is messy, distributed, and under constant probing. The first building block is the subject, which is the entity making a request for access. Subjects can be humans, like employees and contractors, but they can also be non-human identities such as services, automation jobs, and integrations. In zero-trust thinking, a subject is never just a name. It is an identity with properties and context. The identity should be uniquely attributable so actions can be audited and investigated, and it should be managed through a life cycle so access can be granted and removed reliably. The context includes signals like device health, location patterns, and recent behavior, because a legitimate identity can still be used in an illegitimate way if it is compromised. Beginners often focus only on user accounts, but non-human subjects are frequently the bigger risk because they can hold broad permissions and operate continuously. A strong architecture therefore treats every subject, human or non-human, as something that must be identified clearly, given minimal power, monitored carefully, and revoked quickly when it is no longer needed. The next building block is the object, which is the resource being accessed. Objects can be data, like files and records, but they can also be services, like an application endpoint, an administrative console, or an internal application programming interface. Objects are important because zero trust is not only about who is requesting, but also about what is at stake. If the object is highly sensitive, the access decision should be stronger and more restrictive than if the object is low sensitivity. This is where classification and tagging strategies become valuable, because they let the system understand object sensitivity in a consistent way. Beginners sometimes think objects are just servers, but in modern systems, the most important objects are often specific actions, like exporting data, changing permissions, or altering configurations. When you treat actions as objects, you can enforce stronger requirements for high-impact operations without burdening every routine action. The architecture goal is to make object value visible to the access system so policy can be risk-based instead of one-size-fits-all. Once you understand subjects and objects, you can define zones, which are groupings that share similar trust requirements and exposure. Zones can be network segments, but in zero-trust thinking, they can also be logical groupings, like separating administrative functions from user functions, separating sensitive data services from general business services, or separating development environments from production environments. The purpose of zones is to constrain movement and limit blast radius, because a compromise in one zone should not automatically give access to another. Beginners sometimes assume zones are only about network diagrams, but zones are really about policy boundaries where different rules apply. A well-designed zone has a clear purpose, clear entry and exit points, and clear monitoring expectations. This is how you avoid a flat environment where every system can talk to every other system, which is the condition attackers need for fast lateral movement. Zones also create clarity for operations, because you can design controls and logging around them instead of trying to apply the same rules everywhere and hoping they fit. Perimeters in zero trust are different from traditional perimeters, and this difference is where many people get confused. Traditional thinking often imagines one hard outer wall and then a trusted inside, but zero trust expects multiple perimeters that are closer to the resources they protect. These are sometimes called microperimeters, and the idea is that each critical service or data store has its own protection boundary. That boundary might be enforced through identity checks, policy gateways, or application-level authorization, but the key is that it is not based solely on being inside a network. A beginner-friendly way to understand this is to imagine each important room in a building has its own lock and access rules, not just the front door. If someone gets into the lobby, they still have to pass additional checks to enter a restricted room, and those checks can be tailored to the room's sensitivity. This approach reduces the impact of a single stolen credential or compromised endpoint, because the attacker must repeatedly prove legitimacy as they move. It also increases detection opportunities, because each perimeter is a chance to log and evaluate behavior. For these perimeters to work, you need enforcement points where access decisions are made and cannot be bypassed. In many architectures, the enforcement point is the application or service itself, which must verify identity and apply authorization checks consistently for every request. In other cases, an enforcement point might be a gateway that sits in front of services, applying policy before requests reach the backend. The key requirement is that the enforcement point sees the relevant context and has the authority to permit or deny access. Beginners sometimes assume the user interface is the enforcement point, but that is a dangerous misconception because attackers can often bypass interfaces and call backend endpoints directly. Zero Trust designs insist that enforcement happens at the point of action, which means the service that performs an action must validate the subject's right to perform it. Enforcement points must also generate logs that record decisions, because Zero Trust is not only about blocking, it is also about proving and investigating. When enforcement is consistent and visible, the architecture gains the ability to stop improper access and to detect attempts that indicate compromise. Reauthentication is a core zero trust concept because trust is not treated as permanent just because it was granted once. A common beginner mistake is to assume that if you logged in successfully this morning, you should be trusted for everything until you log out. That assumption fails when devices are stolen, sessions are hijacked, or attackers gain access while a user is already authenticated. Reauthentication is the practice of requiring renewed proof when risk increases, such as when accessing a sensitive object, changing permissions, initiating a large export, or performing administrative actions. This is often implemented as step-up authentication, where the system asks for stronger verification at the moment it matters. A typical example is multi-factor authentication, MFA, which adds an additional proof beyond a password, but the deeper idea is that verification strength matches action impact. Reauthentication also applies when context changes, like a sudden location change or a device posture change, because those signals suggest elevated risk. In a well-designed system, reauthentication is not random annoyance. It is a controlled mechanism that protects high-impact actions and reduces the harm of session compromise. Another essential part of integrating Zero Trust is choosing which signals you will use to evaluate requests and ensuring those signals are reliable. Signals can include identity attributes, device health, network context, behavior patterns, and the sensitivity of the object being accessed. Beginners sometimes assume that more signals automatically means better security, but too many signals can create unpredictable behavior and make troubleshooting difficult. The goal is to choose a small set of high-quality signals that strongly correlate with risk and that can be measured consistently. Device health is often important because unmanaged or unpatched devices are more likely to be compromised, and allowing sensitive access from such devices increases risk. Behavioral signals, like unusual access times or unusual data volume, are valuable because they can reveal compromised accounts even when authentication succeeds. Object sensitivity signals are crucial because they allow policies to apply stronger checks to high-value targets without imposing maximum friction on every action. When signals are chosen carefully and logged clearly, you can explain why access was granted or denied, which preserves user trust and supports incident response. Zero trust also changes how you think about lateral movement, because it assumes attackers may get in and focuses on limiting what happens next. In an implicit trust environment, internal movement often depends more on reachability than on need, meaning once an attacker gets inside, they can scan, connect, and escalate quickly. A zero-trust architecture reduces this by requiring explicit authorization for each access attempt and by using zones and perimeters to constrain pathways. That means services should not accept requests simply because they came from an internal address range, and they should not share broad credentials that allow one compromised component to impersonate many others. It also means that administrative access should be separated and protected with stronger reauthentication, because administrative power is what attackers want for persistence and broad control. Beginners sometimes picture zero trust as slowing everything down, but the purpose is to slow down attackers while keeping legitimate work smooth. When access is properly scoped and consistent, users often experience fewer confusing workarounds because the system's rules become predictable. Lateral movement becomes noisy and difficult, which is exactly the effect you want. A practical zero-trust design must address data access specifically, because data is both the most common target and the most common source of harm when controls fail. If a subject is allowed to query sensitive data, the system should enforce least privilege at the record and action level where appropriate, not just at the application level. That might mean restricting bulk exports, requiring stronger verification for large transfers, and monitoring for unusual access patterns that suggest exfiltration. Classification and tagging strategies are powerful here because they let policies treat different objects differently, which is essential in cloud environments where data can be copied and shared rapidly. Beginners sometimes assume that if data is encrypted, it is safe, but encryption does not prevent misuse by authorized identities, which is why authorization and monitoring are central. Zero-trust designs also consider where data can go, not just who can read it, which connects naturally to data loss prevention, DLP, strategies that enforce handling rules at rest and in transit. When data access is governed by explicit policies and supported by detection, the architecture reduces both accidental leakage and malicious exfiltration. Third-party integrations and non-human identities are where zero trust must be applied carefully, because integrations often become silent superusers if they are granted broad permissions. A zero-trust approach treats each integration as a subject with a purpose, and it scopes permissions to that purpose with clear expiration and review. It also avoids long-lived, shared credentials wherever possible and uses narrow identities that can be revoked without disrupting unrelated functions. Because integrations can move data and trigger actions automatically, monitoring must include integration activity and should look for abnormal patterns like unexpected destinations, unusual volumes, or unusual times. Beginners sometimes assume that a vendor integration is trustworthy because it is a known partner, but the security model should not depend on assumptions about perfection. Instead, it should depend on constrained access, continuous verification signals, and auditable logs that show what the integration did. This is how you prevent a third-party compromise from turning into full internal compromise. When integration trust is explicit and minimal, the boundary between organizations stays strong rather than becoming porous. A common obstacle in adopting zero trust is legacy reality, because older systems may not support modern identity integration, granular authorization, or strong logging. The mistake is to conclude that zero trust cannot be used, when the better conclusion is that zero trust must be phased and supported with compensating controls. For example, a legacy system that cannot enforce modern reauthentication might be placed behind a gateway that enforces identity checks and limits access paths. A system that cannot be patched quickly might be isolated in a restricted zone with narrow connectivity and heavy monitoring. Administrative access to legacy systems can be separated and subjected to stricter policies even if the system itself cannot enforce them internally. Beginners should recognize that zero trust is not an all-or-nothing transformation. It is a set of principles that can guide incremental improvements. Each improvement that reduces implicit trust, narrows access, or increases verification and logging is progress. Over time, the architecture becomes more resilient, and the legacy surface becomes more contained and less able to endanger the broader environment. Measuring zero trust effectiveness is important because it is easy to claim you are doing it while still relying on implicit trust in hidden ways. Effective measurement asks whether subjects are uniquely identified and consistently verified, whether objects are protected with appropriate sensitivity-based policies, and whether zones and perimeters actually constrain movement. It also asks whether reauthentication triggers are aligned with risk, meaning high-impact actions require stronger checks and low-impact actions remain smooth. Detection plays a role here as well, because zero trust should increase visibility into access attempts and anomalies, producing signals that are actionable rather than overwhelming. Beginners sometimes think measurement is just counting how many services are behind a gateway, but the more meaningful question is whether an attacker who compromises a user account can still reach sensitive systems easily. If lateral movement is still easy, then zones and perimeters may be too broad or enforcement points may be bypassable. When metrics focus on real outcomes like reduced blast radius and improved detection speed, they guide architecture toward actual risk reduction rather than surface-level implementation. As we bring this to a close, integrating zero trust into architecture is best understood as designing access around explicit decisions that are continuously validated, narrowly granted, and strongly logged. Subjects are the identities making requests, including humans and non-human actors, and they must be managed with clarity, least privilege, and accountability. Objects are the resources and actions being accessed, and their sensitivity should drive policy strength, reauthentication requirements, and monitoring focus. Zones provide structure that limits movement and separates different trust needs, while perimeters move protection closer to what matters rather than relying on a single outer wall. Enforcement points make policies real by ensuring access checks happen at the point of action and cannot be bypassed, and reauthentication ensures trust is not treated as permanent when risk changes. When these concepts work together, you get an architecture that assumes compromise is possible but makes it hard to spread, hard to hide, and easier to contain. That is the practical promise of zero trust for SecurityX learners. Not perfect safety, but a disciplined design that replaces fragile assumptions with repeatable, auditable control.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.